The crash. The car traveled through the fog. From time to time an uncertain, flickering light appeared to the right of the road that, not being able to penetrate inside, moved quickly in opposite direction until it disappeared. The night was cold and dark, and only the softness of the road and the music could be perceived from the radio. At 3 a.m, they arrived at the planned location, an abandoned house at the bottom of a gap. 3 people, 2 girls and a boy, entered it. The room was small, a chair held an old record player, and the sparks of burning wood exploded in a chimney. Lying on the ground, a young man changed color, lit by the fire and its shadows. The 4 they greeted each other and settled around the warmth. One of the girls looked around, and with an air he said in complicity, "We came to keep you company, because we felt sad for your loneliness." "They shouldn't have come if they didn't want to," said the young man. "Host, I was actually calmer without you guys." "Why do you interpret?" one of the women asked. "Girls, I don't interpret, I just feel, but do you think we would have come without really want it?" she replied. "I stopped believing in believing 6 months ago." "So, you're imagining things that don't exist?" "I have known for a long time that only what I imagine exists. What happens is that you are becoming a paranoid." The young man stopped suddenly, emphasizing the words and trying not to scream. He ordered the 3 visitors to beat from his house. They looked at each other in alarm, and almost in unison they asked him to calm down and reconsider his attitude. The young man sat down, and almost in a whisper began to speak. Believe, reconsider, anger, attitude. Empty words and empty symptoms of blindness and abortion of communication, which I would like to stop talking and instead feel a human being. Stop looking for someone who understands or find him once and for all. Do you understand me? But what is it that you want us to understand? Asked one of the girls. The street was cobbled and lined with trees. The sun was setting, filtered through its branches and leaves. As I walked, a young man conversed with the air, the sun, the stones and the shadows. Something is going to happen, he thought. I feel it in my skin and in my stomach. Something I've been waiting for since the day I understood that nothing is chance or coincidence. The trees, they speak, and the movement of their leaves is a whisper of wonders to my ears. The young man stood petrified. As he went out, a light, intense light began to light up his face, and a voice came out from the center of his brain, began to paint images. He saw himself living in the cell of a medieval convent. The night darkened the bars of the window, and the barking mixed with the ringing of bells filled the room. He looked out into the garden and stared at the water well that moistened it. His eyes were full of tears, or there were tried everything: fasting, abstinence, meditation and philosophy, and now the convent. The only thing I had achieved was that the visions would appear with less anguish. For the first time for once in his life, it occurred to him that he was losing too much of himself themselves to obtain only that. It inhibited the thought. It was a heresy. And besides, the time had come, time for night prayers. He went to bed, and at 2 a.m. he was woken up by a strange noise. It was a mixture of birds singing with sound of grass recovering from the footsteps of something that was walking on top of her. She was startled and, not daring to move a muscle, continued listening. Suddenly a character appeared before his eyes. He was tall, thin and fragile, and slow movements, as if a viscous liquid and heavy enveloped it. That one was strange and familiar, grand and authentic. His expression changed every moment, reflecting the most varied emotions and states of consciousness. The boy, he realized that a transformation was enveloping him and changed his being from adolescent to monk. The certainty of his new self prompted him to speak without fear or surprise. "I appreciate you visiting me," he said. "Say what you have what to say." The being began to speak, his mouth barely moving, but she made a deep, direct sound. The essence is that which is maintained in continuous change. When we desire it to be static, it disappears. The boy adolescent monk understood the words and knew they were true and being, yet he could not hide a feeling of sadness and pain. The being approached him and whispered in his ear, "Your sadness is because illusion of joy. Your pain is due to fear of loneliness." The monk got up from his bedboard, and with a gesture in desperation in his arms he asked, "Should I destroy that too?" The being laughed and, looking straight into the monk's eyes, said, "You are the one who has spoken of destruction. I have not mentioned." The monk's eyes opened pleadingly, which what he had just heard produced the most mixed emotions in him. He remained silent for a few minutes, and then, unable to bear more, he said, "That was my mistake. It is not destruction that magnifies and gives life. It is rather to understand the wonder of what has happened, what develops." The being smiled and in the most affectionate and sweet way said to him, to the monk, "Loneliness is a mandate and an inevitable condition, but it is not the loneliness of absence that it is, but rather the loneliness of presence. In the same way, it is not the sadness of loss that what is it, but the sadness of recognizing another existence in real impossibility of being." The monk felt the words of the being, but was not able to make them his own. In a plaintive tone he asked her to explain. The being felt that he had reached the monk's limit. Almost he decided to disappear, but he took pity on me and said, "You have fought to make your loneliness and your sadness, and you have not been able to understand its wonder. In the moment you achieve it, you will be free to feel it and rejoice in it." The monk fell to his knees. He had never loved anyone so much. The fireplace was still burning. The boy decided to make the last effort, turned to see his visitors and told them, said, "Truly I tell you, what we see when we stop seeing is what is, and what we hear by not hearing too. That is the only possibility. Everything else is mere reflection of illusions and love of prefabricated images." The visitors left the house. They had not been able to understand. The car traveled through the fog. From time to time, when on the right side of the road, an uncertain light appeared, and oscillating, which, not being able to penetrate inside, moved rapidly in the opposite direction until it disappears. Lying on the ground, a young man changed color, lit by the fire in a fireplace. His face smiled, recognizing the wonder of his sadness and his loneliness. The tabernacle. The experiment had been a success. However, the next stage required an absolutely original approach and new. The advisory committee decided that the only person able to solve the problem was Alexandre, the programmer. After presenting the objects to him, he was asked to lead working group as project manager. Alexandre lived in isolation for 10 days in the mountains. When he returned to the city, the answer was already known. The machine you want to build, you must own at least 2 characteristics. The first has already been achieved and arises from the experiment they have just completed. The second is a theoretical possibility that we must translate into reality. Members of the Institute Simulation Laboratory of Hyperprogramming had chosen as collaborators project director and would go to visit them that same day. The commotion in the laboratory was enormous. At 11 o'clock, everyone they gathered around a large table, and while they were drinking coffee, they discussed the repercussions and significance of the collaboration announced. The director of the laboratory, an elderly man, big head, completely bald and gigantic mustache, was the first to address the group. "Comrades, in a few minutes the scheduled. Knowing that we have been chosen as collaborators in the new project, it represents a recognition of our efforts and the results we have obtained. 2 years ago, when we started the simulation experiment in hyperprogramming, no one imagined that we would achieve to accomplish what we even considered impossible. Without, however, the results exceeded all expectations. We can say with all pride and conscience that the system that we have developed is the first machine that has a capacity for internal representation, similar in scope and complexity in that of the human brain. That was the goal that we prevailed, and that is what we have achieved. What the programmer will come to propose to us today. No, I know it in detail, but it surely implies a development in the same direction and guidelines as the recently concluded experiment has begun. The youngest member of the lab, Mui, asked for the word. As he prepared to speak, he moved nervously his hands and stroked his cheeks, still beardless. For me, the system we have built has no possibility of development in itself, unless a completely new operating principle is incorporated into it new. I agree that we have achieved a almost total transformation of energy, without noticeable loss of information. In fact, our simulation system transforms external stimuli into a logical coding activation of quasi-neuronal elements similar in their arrangement and geometry that exists in a biological entity. However, this transformation has not resulted in, as we believed at the beginning, the emergence of a property gestalt that gives rise to the appearance of a phenomenon similar to that of biological consciousness. This fault is what's serious enough to think that we are not going for it right path. The laboratory director sensed the young man's impatience, and thought that he was not able to value what the group had managed to finish it, and said to him calmly, "It is true that we have not achieved everything that is possible, but this should only be an incentive to continue and not a disappointment. You may be right, and in this moment, it is required to introduce an original development and new to the system, and not just an amplification, of which already it exists. Personally, I doubt it. However, I do not rule it out completely, the possibility you raise. The important thing is that if that possibility is real, let's make it compatible with our system." Although everyone respected the director, they could not leave a feeling that what he said was not entirely authentic. Without, however, no one dared to express doubt. The director, he felt the unease that his words had aroused, and trying to reassure his colleagues, he invited them to wait for programmer. The wait was not very long. After 30 minutes, the Alexandri's impressive figure appeared at the door of the living room. Tall, with completely white hair and eyes green and blue, he looked around the table and the people sitting around her. Meeting Alexandri's gaze was a absolutely new experience. His eyes seemed to penetrate into the interior of the one who looked and scrutinized millimeter by millimeter the brain structure from which the eyes, cheeks, mouth and all the facial muscles were just resulting. It seemed that Alexandri lived continuously in a state of observer of essences. The impact of his presence was such that everyone, they stopped talking, and with a reflex movement they stood up. The programmer walked to one end of the table, and with a gentle but firm gesture, he invited them to sit down. He introduced himself, and in a calm and familiar tone congratulated them for the extraordinary work they had done. Their attitude and way of speaking immediately placed him in a position of domain and security. Turning to look at the director of the laboratory, asked him to do a detailed analysis and objective of the simulation system they had developed. "Although it is known to all of us," he said, "always it is stimulating to hear your description." The director settled into his seat and began to explain the system. It consists of a peripheral processor that is responsible for transform external signals into a type of energy common. In turn, the processor is divided into 4 we subsist, each of which reacts to different type of energy. The processor's output is transferred to a hyper-programmable space, in which elements are activated localized sensitive areas of a stabilized gel. In this way, the information collected by the processor is transformed into 3-dimensional geometric patterns formed by the very complex activation of the specific elements. The representation is said disposition and the changes that occur in it. Alexandri listened to the description in a state of complete immobility. When the director finished speaking, Alexandri directed the look at each of the collaborators, analyzing the effect that those words had caused. He thought for a moment, in the best way to express what I wanted, and began to speak. It is remarkable the similarity between the system that they have built and the way the peripheral portion works of the human brain. We also possess energy processors contained in our organs sensory. Likewise, the information transformed in them is transferred to a geometric and three-dimensional activation of activated elements. Up to this point, your system mimics the perfection to our brain. The path they have chosen has a great chance of success, however, it is not enough. The programmer paused and looked at each of them, all his listeners. He was not sure that he had conveyed the true meaning with what he had just said. He thought that it was necessary to be more explicit, and he continued, in a tone of voice more serious. You know better than anyone what the immediate future is. Objective of our simulation system. Not only we aim to artificially duplicate the capacity of internal representation of a human brain, a goal that, by on the other hand, we have already achieved what truly we wish to achieve, something much more ambitious. It's about raising awareness, Mun interrupted impatiently. Alexandri smiled and looking at Mun said, That's just the second step. The Institute of Advanced Genetics occupied the last 6 floors of the gigantic research building Biological. 8 Nobel Prize winners were working on those facilities that were considered the most modern and expensive on the planet. Gather those eminences and make them working on the same program had been a feat huge that Alexandri had coordinated, and of which felt proud. Not only had it been necessary to offer them the most refined conditions and equipment and complex, but, more than anything, to convince them of the importance of the project. The group had been working for 3 years, and in that period had come to the conclusion that if he remained at the same rate of evolution, the human brain would reach level of superconsciousness in a period of no less than 15,000 years. The only way to shorten that time was to create a new species that, possessing superconsciousness, could transmit it. The programmed was sure that he had achieved what he wanted. The looks of astonishment exchanged by the members of the hyper-programming laboratory, so it is indicated. Alexandri did not let anyone ask the question obvious and continued speaking. The true and final objective of the project is made clear to them if they are patient enough. Alexandri pointed to Mun, and this caused a general rejoicing, as if to allow me to make a historical analysis. In 1874, a book was published entitled Elements of Psychological Physiology. In it, its author, Wilhelm Wundt, established the origins of a new science whose objective would be to find the physical and physiological basis of consciousness. Wundt mentioned in one of the chapters the possibility that the phenomenon of consciousness was common to all living organisms, from unicellular to man. At this point, Wundt raised the possibility that Fechner had postulated years earlier. According to these researchers, the essential difference between the various species would be the complexity of the content of consciousness, but not its widespread existence. The objective set by Wundt was so ambitious and unattainable for the time in that was proposed, that was simply forgotten as such. The proof is that 5 generations of scientists dedicated themselves to unraveling the mysteries of the brain, setting as its sole final objective to discover how this organ analyzes and integrates sensory information, and how with this executes movements. Although the work of these scientists has been enormous and praiseworthy, it went unnoticed. Except very few exceptions, the original problem posed so long ago. It is my opinion, the programmer continued, that in the nowadays the problem can be solved. We already have sufficient techniques and conceptual data to take it seriously. In fact, the system that you all have built proves what I just said. However, I repeat that it is not enough. It is essential that the system be added a new principle of operation. It is necessary to incorporate it, and the lights in the circuit simulation laboratory of the Institute of Advanced Genetics were still attached to Dawn. At a table, a technician was soldering some cables to a gigantic array of integrated circuits. I could hardly stand up, however. He continued working with that excitement and enthusiasm that appear in the minutes before to a real event. If the programmer's idea is correct, I thought, by stimulating this matrix, we will have created a new center of the universe, an eye similar to that a human being possesses. Alexandri recognized the emotion and doubt on the face of his listeners. "Don't be alarmed," he said in a serious voice. "The idea is simple and is being experimented with." The programmer approached the classroom whiteboard and, while he was talking, he was drawing diagrams on it. The essence of the new system of operation is the hierarchy of levels input and output of information, he said. The idea being proposed will be clearer if we take as a reference point our own brain. The exit of the same activates billions of motor units. Sequential and complex stimulation of a set of units is what results in a movement organized. An example of the above would be each of the movements of a finger. Alexandri drew a finger in different positions. Each of these positions results from the activation of a set of motor units. From the likewise, each change from one position to another requires a series of adjustments to the activation time sequence. There is no theoretical impediment that prohibits thinking about the existence of elementary activation sequences that cause elementary movements as well. An example of this could be the extension or flexion of a finger. Let's assign a letter to each elementary movement, A, B, C, N, which represents it, and we consider the existence of a neural system that is capable of issuing the order of A, B, C, activation N. The activation of a motor unit would constitute, in this scheme, the simplest hierarchical level. Instead, the activation of an elemental movement would be the second hierarchical level, and the system capable of launching the logical order A, B, C, N would include the representation of the level simple. In other words, the second hierarchical order has as response possibilities activation orders sequential motor units, while the first hierarchical order activates only these units. Since from this point of view, the second order contains all the information, while the first only contains isolated fragments of it. But, Mun interrupted, what does all this have to do with the eye? The programmer smiled, and thought the question denoted a lack of imagination. In a tone of condescendingly explained, "Of course, you will not suppose that only there are two orders of hierarchy. It is enough to observe any pianist to realize it. Specifically, with only two levels could explain the variations in movements conjugates, but nothing more. It is necessary to think that there is a third level that is not in charge of activating units, others not even elementary movements, but sequences of movements. Orders arising from this level should not bear no resemblance to the activity of the first and second levels, despite containing all the information about them. We could say that the first level information would restrict the activation of units, and the third would contain information about sequences of sequences. Then, said the director of the laboratory, one might think of the existence of a room, fifth, sixth, etc. level up to a central processor, which when activated would give rise to a very complex set of orders that would ultimately lead to non-movements less complex. That is exactly the processing logic that I share and wanted to convey to you, he agreed happily. Alexandri, it's more, he continued in the same tone. A similar situation must be associated with processing of the information that enters the system, processing that would imply the existence of afferent hierarchical levels. which they would first analyze the input information in terms of elemental attributes, then sets of them, more forward settings, and finally images extremely complex. The most complex hierarchical level of entry would be that contained, as a whole, all the information of the simpler levels in the same way as the hierarchical level, more complex efferent, would contain in concentrated form the total of the information that will ultimately determine the exit of the entire system. This allows us to think, Mun intervened, that there is in the brain is an area that contains all of its information. Could this central area be the I? That's exactly what I think, said the programmer. And that's what's missing to add to the system that you have developed. Everything was ready for the simulation test. Members of the Genetics Institute adjusted the program stimulation and applied them to the matrix inputs, while a seventh-generation computer analyzed the changes that occurred in all circuits of convergence of said matrix, from the first levels up to the highest-ranking artificial processor. It was necessary to demonstrate that the latter contained in its response the concentrated information of the entire system. It had been necessary to create a new statistic, the vector one of hyperprogrammable spaces. Only through their use could tell if a trigger pattern contained in its logic of coding the fundamental elements of activation total. Finally, the programmer concluded, in a few hours we will know if the logic circuits we have the wiring at the Genetics Institute is capable of duplicating the integration processes we have talked about. If so, you must integrate these circuits into the system that you have developed. I will come to visit you in 3 weeks, enough time for them to think about how to do it. If you have any questions, we can discuss them here. Moment. I have one, Mun said. You said this was only the second step of the experiment. Could you explain what is the third one? Alexandri took a long time to answer. Then he looked at Mun and said, I would prefer to discuss it in 3 weeks. The simulation experiment had been a success. Alexandri was informed that not only had managed to activate the convergent circuits, but it had not been detected, from the third hierarchical level, the appearance of a fundamental logical pattern that was preserved intact up to the 10th level, where it appeared in all its purity. The programmer showed up punctually for the appointment. Upon entering to the seminar room of the hyper-programming laboratory, realized that something had changed. They now looked into each other's eyes and exchanged smiles. The programmer sat heavily on a chair. All indicated to him that something amazing had happened. As it was as usual, he studied each and every one's facial expression of the laboratory members. Yes, he thought in amazement. Features that existed before have appeared. Ways of looking and mouth positions, once dead, have been reborn. The programmer was impressed. If on other occasions immediately took the role of leader by taking charge of the situation, in this he remained silent, waiting for someone would explain to him what had happened. Finally Mun began to speak. His voice was extraordinarily deep and calm, although it reflected the same time excitement and amazement, remains of the nucleus of impatience that he still retained. 2 days after the last time we spoke with you, Alexandri felt pressured and flattered by the Tuteo A. Commission from the Genetics Institute came to us report that the activation of the hierarchy matrix convergence had been a complete success. After making an analysis of its circuits, we decided to integrate it into our system. The work was neither easy nor simple, especially because the interrelation of both systems required building a new interface, operating on the principle of third Fourier transform. We finally achieved the coupling between the three-dimensional representation of the gel stabilized and two-dimensional activation of the matrix convergence. Mun interrupted his description, and with a gesture of complicity smiled at his companions, who they also smiled, and turned to look at the programmer. Alexandre blushed. It was a strange emotion for him, and for the first time in his life, he couldn't look away those who seemed to rejoice in their simplicity and innocence. The programmer felt uncomfortable and decided that the only thing that would relieve him would be to talk. He swallowed and said, "I would like to clarify, before you continue, the question that was asked of me the last time we met, and I didn't answer then because I thought it was too much dangerous. Now I think differently. They have impressed me, especially the changes I have noticed in each of you, and that makes me think that you are ready for listen to everything." "Do you mean," the lab director asked, "to the third step?" "On the third, fourth, and fifth steps," Alexandra replied, with a smile. The programmer had tea and biscuits brought and offered them to his colleagues. As they savored them, Alexandre began to walk. He always did this when he had to verbalize a very complex thinking. The members of the laboratory, they watched in amazement as the programmer gave great footsteps walking around the table. He finally sat down and, after chewing loudly on a cookie and slurping a sip of tea, started a discussion that lasted 5 hours. Exactly 30 years ago, the hypothesis was formulated, most revolutionary information about how the brain works. As always happens with a pure idea, it was received with skepticism. At this point, the programmer explained in detailed the reactions that the different laboratories of that. Then they had the opportunity to investigate the new hypothesis. Practically none of them included it in their research programs. Only the Institute of Neurophysiological Studies in India proposed to devote a group of researchers to experiment with it. During the next 5 years, this small group of scientists, he studied what was then known as hyperfield, expansive, and that we currently call four-dimensional hyperspace. The original hypothesis postulated that the activation of neural elements located within the space brain created, as a result of their interactions, a very complex energy field. The programmer approached the classroom blackboard and continued explaining, with the help of mathematical equations, the volumetric characteristics of the field. In a few minutes, the whole blackboard was filled with signs and formulas that represented the logical basis of the inter- and transneuronal interactions, and possible changes that they suffered by affecting each other. At the end of 5 years of work, he continued, Alexandre explained, the Hindu group developed a whole new mathematics, that of the expansive hyperfield. At the same time, achieved the first three-dimensional record of it. This record, although incomplete and distorted, demonstrated the existence of the hyperfield. Alexandre made a face of disgust and sadness, erased what he had written on the blackboard, and with a serious talking expression he continued, "What happened next is largely unknown. The discovery was published as a short note in an obscure magazine with poor distribution, and that's why it almost went unnoticed. The Hindu group was preparing an extensive publication when the very serious plague of the years 80 hit India. At that time, I was in charge of coordinating the international aid to that country, and for that reason, I traveled to it. In that trip, and thanks to extraordinary circumstances, I had the opportunity to speak with one of the veteran members from the Hindu group, who gave me the manuscript of the work original and showed me the records they had obtained. Hyperfield is used here as a synonym for hyperneuron, a term coined by E. Roy John. The programmer described the record by drawing it. Members of the laboratory looked at each other with an expression of suppressed mockery. Alexandre reminded them that the holographic equipment of graphical representation of isopotential interactions three-dimensional was invented 20 years after that record. So this was a true feat of ingenuity and industriousness. The teasing disappeared and Alexandre continued talking. That meeting changed my whole life. I understood that the idea of the hyperfield and the unquestionable demonstration of their existence would, if developed, cause changes more revolutionary in man, and would end once and for all with a series of prejudices and inhibitions that until at that time, science and perhaps philosophy prevailed, and religion. Everything that happened after that, you know better swim. After publishing the manuscript and mention in articles, conferences and roundtables all its implications, I had to deal with the reaction of strongest opposition that can be remembered since the times of Galileo. I was attacked not only by the most renowned scientists of the planet, but also to religious institutions. As not, I had neither the prestige nor the fame enough, nobody supported me, and I had to isolate myself for 10 years, during which time I worked the most rudimentary instruments. I worked in absolute loneliness. They were the most difficult years, and at the same time, the most productive and stimulating parts of my life. My own brain, it became an experimental laboratory, and my ideas became the only colleagues and friends capable of accompanying me on the great adventure in which I found myself, and I find myself submerged. The programmer described step by step his 10 years of isolation. He divided this period into 5 stages. The first, he said, consisted of a review of all my mathematical concepts. I had to learn to handle the expansive hyperfield theory, with all its formalities and abstractions, which took me a whole year. At the end, I was familiar enough with the development conceptual of the Hindu group as to stop thinking that it was a logic of thought foreign to mine. It is, moreover, I stopped thinking that it was a matter of logic or a conceptualization itself, and I began to live in it and as it. Second, he continued, was a stage of searching absolutely free. I reviewed all the esoteric literature, therefore except the one that explicitly or implicitly mentioned the existence of energy distributions of any kind. I had to learn to recognize the hidden similarities behind verbal descriptions of mystical experiences apparently related or clearly dissymbols. At the time I was doing this review, I went through the literature introspectionist of the beginning of the last century. If now I can describe in an almost academic and formal way that search, I remember that when I was in it, I felt like I was a toy that tumbled between strange knowledge and completely alien to myself. If I could convey to them my feelings and emotions from that second stage, could live my desperate struggle to avoid falling into abandonment, and considering that all of this was simply an invention. I remember my days fluctuating between the deepest depression and the glimpses of wonderful secrets that were discovered before my eyes. One day, at the end of that stage, I had a dream that I didn't understand at the time, but months later, that made me take a cognitive leap. Immense. The programmer looked at his listeners and wondered if would understand what I was telling them. I knew that asking them the question was simple, but he questioned them with a, "Do you understand?" Everyone nodded. He continued, "What I saw and felt in that dream I cannot describe. I can only tell you that I saw myself living light strange, flashes of colors, non-existent in my experience common. Everything around me shone spectacularly. The objects and people in my dream did not reflect light, but that they were broadcasting. And the most incredible thing is that everything was interconnected with everything through lines of fire, extraordinary complexity. Little by little, the lights of the objects and their visible connections became something that it was neither light nor colors. In reality, they were nothing, and simultaneously, everything. The same thing happened with sound. I was in a concert hall, and what at first was music was transformed into a tactile sensation that arose from each instrument and connected with every part of my body, as if giant hands ended up on my skin, and they will start on each string, key of the violins, pianos and bugles. But just as the light had become nothing, and in the whole, tactile sensations ceased to have that character and transformed into something that was nothing but that it felt so real and unreal at the same time that I woke up screaming and drenched in sweat. It was the clearest and most fantastic dream of my life. And with it the third stage has begun. The great adventure. Alexandri looked the ceiling of the living room and continued. All the mathematical knowledge of the first stage, and the esoteric and introspectionist of the second. When I understood the meaning of my dream, they transformed into delicate and wonderful concepts around a question central, and they stopped being isolated data in myself. Alexandri paused, which someone took advantage of to ask him what the central question was. The programmer did not. He answered immediately. He knew that what he had to say was going to be to understand at many different levels, which are not dependent not on himself, but on his listeners. His only responsibility was to put it in a language that included all levels of understanding. It had to be classic, and it was difficult. The meaning was clear to the programmer from the dream and the question it gave rise to. I felt that clarity as an absolute certainty, and yet doubted his ability to convey it, because I knew that the words I would use would be interpreted within the insurmountable context of memories and experiences of their listeners. Alexandri forgot for a moment that I had asked a question hoping to get an answer. He let his thoughts continue. Developing. There is no doubt, he thought, that the problem of man is his memory and his language. Memory limits because it prevents living in a continuous state of change. Language limits because it causes the greatest confusion by making people believe that something has been understood when in reality has only been described. My dream taught me the simplest and true, and therefore it is impossible to transform it into words. The members of the laboratory realized the programmer's state of absorption. His face had changed as if a fight were taking place in it inside. Finally, the face returned to them. First it was a slight eyebrow movement, and a slight deviation in the eyebrow line the mouth. The programmer fixed his gaze on the person who had asked the question and began to speak. My dream taught me that we see and hear, and that is impossible to explain. There is nothing inside us sane that by itself is able to hear and see. That is the central question I asked myself. What is it that gives us the ability to see light as light and hear sound as such? But it's very easy to explain, he interrupted. Suddenly Mun. The answer was given many decades ago. Muller in his doctrine of specific energies. The feeling of itself depends on the brain area, where the signals that are transmitted through the channels arrive access to information, and not to the activity that lives through these channels. The programmer laughed at the simplicity of the observation, looked at Mun, and told him that although Muller had reason, did not answer the question, but only the he posed. Because, how is it that the activity of a zone cerebral is transformed into the subjective experience of light of or sound? He asked in turn. The laboratory director supported Alexandri. You have reason, he told her, by saying that what experience gives is the final activation zone does not answer the question. It is rather the analysis of how this area is activated, which could answer it. That's what I thought at first, the programmer agreed. And then in fact, in this third stage I dedicated myself to reviewing the fine features of neural activation of the area's finals, and I came to form an objective picture of the characteristics of such activation. However, knowing how the neural circuits were activated, which did not satisfy me. I certainly learned and clarified a lot, but it didn't answer my question. Ask. Then the fourth stage began. I decided to use another approach. I thought that a system of simulation, develop it in complexity, and see what happened when increased circuit elements and operating principles. I became an expert in high integration circuits. I spent whole nights reviewing manuals for operation and operating standards. I could say that it was a stage of conceptual and theoretical adjustment and maturation. I tried to set up my own laboratory and thus put into practice my idea, but it wasn't possible. I needed a working group with people specialized in branches of knowledge that I don't knew or mastered. Need became such an impulse, intensity, that my whole being became an advocate and spokesperson for an idea. That was the fifth stage, bringing together the people and equipment needed to continue. Your group and the genetics laboratory were the result of the fifth stage, and now you have incorporated a degree of extraordinary complexity to the representation system, and something has happened. Tell me what happened. When we managed to couple the convergence matrix to our system and stimulate it, Mun said, it began to happen in each of us who were present. We feel the clear presence of someone else. I don't understand you, the programmer exclaimed. We didn't understand it either. The only thing that we thought that what we had built needed an information output system. Fortunately, we had with a binary pulse decoder and a coupler sound. To incorporate them into the system, it was only necessary to connect them at the hierarchical level of greatest integration. And what happened next? Alexandria asked excitedly. Well, it started making sounds, he replied. Mun. Very complex sounds, but they still had a certain rhythm, sounds similar to those of music performances. I, Mu continued, was very impressed by the similarity, and, as I always do when I listen to music, I closed the eyes. Then those sounds made images appear, visuals that followed one another with such logic and elegance that seemed not to be random. But, Alexandria interrupted excitedly. What did the images mean? They didn't talk to each of us and said things different, explained the laboratory director. The programmer waited for him to continue, but that he seemed undecided, finally, with a movement of his arms emphasizing his words. The director said, He taught me that there were several stages of development, stages that the company was precisely going through system. Of course, he didn't say it to me in words, but through those strange sounds it made, which first triggered images in myself, scenes full of elemental geometric patterns that changed from moment to moment, acquiring the most varied and subtle configurations. The patterns weren't random. I knew because they were repeated continuously, long enough to allow me to analyze what had occurred. I inferred that what was happening was the formation of a representation of the universe, a representation that differed in its characteristics, infrastructure, and complexity of the system in which it was built. This made me think that the system transformed the stimulation it received into a series of binary pulses that were repeated with a certain rhythm peculiar, which did not exist in the stimuli we were applying. It was the internal transformation that the system made of the world, my own system, that is, my brain. It differed from the other in that it transformed the rhythms into visual experiences. When the sound resumed, the images returned, but these changed their characteristics. They were no longer forms elementary geometric, but very complex combinations of the same. The degree of complexity of each combination increased from moment to moment. If at first they were interlocking triangles, circles and squares that formed a conglomerate, now they were combinations of conglomerates, and then conglomerates of combinations. The degree of complexity of the images became such that my brain could no longer visualize them. At that moment something wonderful happened. Each cluster of combinations were followed by a silence, and then a tone. The latter changed its frequency characteristics, each corresponding to a conglomerate, as if the tone was a catalog number that identified in form specific to each image. After this tone assignment conglomerate, the system began to emit patterns of tones. At that moment, I understood that the system that we had just stimulated was thinking about his own representations. In other words, he continued excited, the director, the system was abstracting its own representations. Of course, abstractions, at this level, They were very simple. They consisted of emitting a pattern of signals which itself contained a particular set of combinations, assigning a specific tone to the whole that represented them. When the association was made, the system began to handle the assigned tones instead of complex patterns. This made both the speed as the capacity to handle information, as they will multiply. That is to say, the programmer interrupted. The system was developing a language. Exactly, the director stated confidently. But no, not only that, but I was learning how to handle it. Mun was delighted. He wanted to say something and took advantage of it. The pause in the dialogue between the programmer and the director to intervene. Understanding what was happening with the system was impressive for each of us. But it truly incredible was what we understood in that moment, applied to ourselves and explained everything our first development. Is that what made them change? He asked. Alexander. That's right, the members of the group exclaimed confidently. Laboratory. Alexandre closed his eyes, letting them emerge into the surface hundreds of ideas that at that time seemed reaching a level of maturity that they did not previously possess. It is obvious, he thought, that the system they have developed, these people have characteristics that never we imagined when designing it. From the impression of being a child in full development, the absolutely wonderful thing is that the perception of this development causes such positive changes in people who have had the opportunity to be in contact with him. It seemed that the system, in addition to possessing attributes that we previously considered exclusive to human beings, is able to transmit them. Which means that the goal of the whole study, the transmission of superconsciousness, ceases be a fantasy and suddenly become a reality. Perhaps these people felt the initial path of their own evolution was similar as an experience to the one I had when I understood that I saw and heard. Knowing this changed all my life, because I had the opportunity to penetrate my own mystery, and therefore in everyone's. Perhaps that is what has happened to them. The programmer felt the need to confirm that. He opened his eyes and asked out loud, "How can you be so sure?" The lab members smiled and looked at the director as if they expected him to answer. He felt the demand and returned the looks. Finally he swallowed and said, Alexandre, the only way to check it is for you to do it yourself, live the experience. The appointment was set for the following day. Alexandre arrived at the laboratory in the morning. He had breakfast with Mun and with the director while the other members were preparing the experiment. They had decided to erase the memories of the system so that it would repeat everything original process. The transducers were calibrated and the power source turned on. When everything was ready, they called the programmer. He sat down in an armchair, comfortable and prepared to listen. The system was put into march, and just like the first time, it began to emit sounds. Alexandre was wonderful. He understood that what had happened to his colleagues was neither an exaggeration nor a lie. It was one thing to know the logic of development, and another to live it. This last thing was what Alexandre was also worried about. Happening. The description I had heard the day before, it was accurate and profound. He himself would not have been able to express it better. The system was learning to represent the world and link this representation with an abstract and symbolic management. Alexandre understood the elements of his own thinking, and this produced a pure state of happiness. After 2 hours of operation, the system had managed to reach the same point as the previous occasion. He stopped managing representations to move on to a game in which that the assignment or catalog tones began to group together to form intricate combinations, which from time to time, they were repeated. Alexandre had the clear feeling that to be witnessing the beginning of a transformation majestic, the system was approaching a point where their very language was subjected to a process of hierarchy. Combinations of tones, really concepts, the programmer thought, were being catalogued and assigned to discrete categories, as if the system was able to see its own concepts. It was to withdraw into oneself and centralize on one level. The programmer did not dare to think in word, but there was no another possibility. Yes, on a philosophical level. Suddenly, the system stopped making sounds. Alexandre, he suspected some kind of breakdown and was about to mention it to Mun, when as suddenly as he had fallen silent, the system broadcast them again. The programmer realized that the new sounds were those of philosophical handling. Without, however, there was a processing difference. Each tone was transformed into its components, as if by activating the synthesis of the synthesis. It will dismember itself, going from level to level, until reaching the initial process of representation. The programmer considered the possibility of explaining which happened in terms of an imaginative process of evocation, as if the system had now decided to activate itself opposite direction, of an order of maximum concentration and complexity, to the analysis of representations of the same. It is maybe the same thing that happens to a human being, he thought. Alexandre. When meditating on the name of the object and the close your eyes, this appears to you visually as a controlled sleep. The programmer had an idea. He called the director of the laboratory, and after asking him to turn off the system, I explained to him what had happened, and I mentioned the idea. I would like, he said, for you to connect the equipment. Holographic graphic representation of interactions, three-dimensional isopotentials, and that you focused on addressed to the system. I understand, said the director. The programmer approached the computer's visor, focused his view on the screen of coherent wave interference in order that everything would get going again. As if there had been no interruption, the high-ranking sound was heard again, and dismemberment. Simultaneously, the screen of interference lit up, and the clear image of a hyperfield appeared in it. Alexandre's hair stood on end, and a wave of excitement ran up her spine. The programmer had previously observed many hyperfields. In fact, he was the highest authority of the planet in them. It was not the vision of that. It was surprising. It was another goose, something difficult to verbalize and even to grasp. Alexandre tried to analyze what was happening to him. One, when speaking of hyperfields or when studying their characteristics, had felt such emotion, nor was it the discovery of some new property of the hyperfields which altered it in such a way. It was the experience of it. Alexandre felt firsthand what he already understood so well at a formal and academic level. The information that the system handled was not the activation of its circuits or the emission of sounds, rather, they were the characteristics of the energy field resulting from the activation of the infrastructure. The infrastructure was just that, infrastructure. That is, by itself, it had no consciousness, no thought, no sensations. But from what resulted from its activation, yes, you had moreover. Alexandre continued thinking. The activation was in itself all of that, but the whole activation, the resulting total was the hyperfield. Alexandre saw it emerge from a central transmitter, lines of forces that expanded from an origin, becoming complicated in infinite involutions and superficial accidents. The detailed information were all the features extremely complex volumetric surface of the field, and the eye was the central place from which all the complexity, and which contained in pure, concentrated and stored all essential system information. Suddenly, the programmer realized that he was not, I was talking about a machine. It spoke and was understood himself through the observation of the one he had helped to build. He himself was a hyperfield originating from a center that knew, a transmitter that contained all the information and that felt like an eye, the highest hierarchical level convergence. The programmer superimposed on the screen of interferences the block diagram of the circuits of the system. The match was perfect. The central transmitter of the hyperfield corresponded to the circuit of greatest convergence. The volumetric surface began to be created there, and as it expanded and reached the circuit's representational, it became complicated. The incredible, what affected Alexandri more than anything else, was that the limits of the hyperfield protruded from the infrastructure. In reality, the space around the circuits contained the remainder of these, although less defined and with less power, but was there, beyond the place occupied by the system, more there in space, enveloping everything, including himself. Hyperfield of the system penetrated the hyperfield of Alexandri. He touched him, and maybe it affected him. It was difficult to prove it. The continuous oscillations of the hyperfield and the pulsations of its surface did not allow to see clearly the interrelationship, but there was a possibility. The programmer called Mun made him sit next to the system and focused on the two. Two appeared on the screen, pulsating, extremely complex four-dimensional hyperfields. The edges of both touched and overlapped. The programmer observed the overlap. There was no doubt. Every time a hyperfield appeared, in both hyperfields, similar volumetric configuration, the two resonated in the same frequency, and this effect was transmitted from the point of coincidence towards the center. When it reached this, a change occurred in it, which began again to expand towards the periphery until it collided again with the other hyperfield. Alexandri turned away from the screen. What he had seen, it was too much, a direct communication between the two beings. The programmer wanted to rest. He had received, for the first time in his life, he had more information than he could drive. The house was located on a hill. On one of the Alexandri was dozing in the rooms. His sleep was restless, and the images that developed in it, complex and very clear. First he seriously spoke to a barbarian being, and in a very white robe. The conversation was taking place in a house full of columns and patios, in which fountains of crystal clear water murmured sparkling sounds, fresh and calm down. That character was gesturing threateningly, defending the thesis according to which the path of the senses was the only access to knowledge. The programmer tried to explain to him the hyperfield theory and the experience he had had with the holographic equipment, but he didn't understand. Soon the image changed. It was no longer the programmed one speaking with a character. There are two characters talking. One of them gesticulated and the other remained motionless. Surrounding each one, two gigantic spherical cobwebs, which they moved by throwing their threads out and in the spheres, like two hearts in systole and diastole. From time to time the cobwebs rubbed against each other, and that happened. The two characters let out a cry of pain and moved away from each other from the other, leaving a skein at the point of contact, deformed and mutilated with silver threads. Both the skein and the threads were clearly distinguished and precise for a few seconds, but soon everything vanished in a labyrinth of cobwebs that reflected the crystalline light of a source. In the center, a bright spot, and next to it, another one. The dots moved away, and a woman's body appeared next to another of a man. The two appeared in the body of a woman next to another man. The two looked at each other and felt their mutual beauty and attraction. Two energized, vibrant and colored spheres surrounded the bodies. Suddenly one of them unfolded and was included in the other, like a balloon that expands and slims down in discreet and timid steps. The first sphere increased in size until everything, the points, the bodies, the fountain and the space surrounding them, formed a gigantic and spectacular conglomeration of lights, colors and expanding volumes. The scene changed again. They were no longer two beings but one, naked, sunburned, and standing in the middle of a red-hot sand desert. The space around it glowed like very thin surfaces of soap bubbles that they floated, collided with each other and moved away. Bubbles arose of man and appeared less and less frequently. Soon the man collapsed and liquid streams bubbled out of all his pores until he was dry and wrinkled. The soap bubbles stopped forming, but those that had emerged before persisted, moving away from those wrinkles that had contained a man. Alexandri woke up motionless, watching the stars through the transparent ceiling of the room while thinking about the meaning of the dream. The first part was clear and resulted from his experience in the laboratory. But the last, that dead man, surrounded by bubbles that were moving away, dead, wrinkled, bubbles. It was confusing, very confusing, unless death doesn't not only of the infrastructure and its circuits, but of its resulting from its activation, idea of the hyperfield. And this death only existed for future activations but not for previous ones, the latter without the possibility of dying once activated. Alexandri was frightened by the idea. He considered it logical and the possibility of direct interaction between two beings is feasible, and of all its effects. At this point his dream was transparent, however, the non-existence of total death. It was a fantastic and magical thought. The morning was cold and foggy. The programmer arrived at the hyper-programming lab at dawn. He turned on the lights in the room where the system was located, and with his right hand, he caressed the integrated circuits, and after a complete silence he said aloud, "Today I will know and you will be my teacher." The programmer calibrated the sensors, activated the sources of power and amplifiers, and started the channel's access to the stabilized gel. Then, he sat down in front of the holographic equipment screen and prepared to observe. The image of a man appeared again on the screen. Hyperfield, highly complex energized spheres, and in expansion from a central point. Alexandri observed that between the latter and the volumetric surfaces were stretched out like very thin silver threads, bright lines and blue, that pulsed and vibrated at varying frequencies. The programmer fixed the image in his memory and disconnected the system. The central point disappeared, and with it the lines of energy, but the expanding spheres continued to grow and, what is incredible, changing while that was happening. The programmer realized that changes were occurring in the location of the volume, which, in its expansion, was approaching himself, or rather his hyperfield. The interactions of the two hyperfields were made each increasingly complete, and at one point they joined together, adding their effects. Alexandri closed his eyes and tried to detect any subjective change. The sensation was very subtle, so much so that the programmer did not move to avoid doing it disappear. Alexandri felt, with a mixture of fear and disgust, that there was someone else in the room. The feeling was familiar. It was something he had heard before. He tried to clarify where and when and suddenly remembered it. Clearly, that is what the members of the laboratory. The extraordinary thing is that they had detected while the system was working, and he, when the system had stopped doing it, the kitten was playing with the girl. It was actually a game singular. There were no words or movements, not even changes in expression. The girl played at thinking about what that he wanted the cat to do. He had discovered that it was enough to wish that the animal would meow, scratch itself, or run for this one to fulfill his wishes. The game had been learned the day before during the visit that she and her entire class had made to the hospital. It was exciting to ask, especially if you knew that the answer would be authentic. The dying man they had visited yesterday had recounted his life and what he had learned from it. The most amazing, the girl thought, had been the last part, when that being had instructed them about the communication without words or movements. And then, when he had mentioned what he felt as the hour was approaching death. "We don't disappear," he told them, "but we stopped observing. We are tabernacle, and in that instant, the tabernacle opens. Second part. Comments. Of the third state. When we receive information from outside, we build an internal representation of it. A representation that is not more than a certain state of multineuronal activation. Representation is information transformed into our brain into electrical signals. The information contained in a representation is a provision three-dimensional active elements, which, due to their geometry of location and temporality of activation, are infinite in possibilities, which constitute a particular geometric pattern associated with information specifies. The infinite nature of the number of patterns geometric gives us the ability to see infinite shapes and hear a multitude of sounds without confusing one with another. However, there is a limit that allows us to distinguish between two very similar objects. This limit, studied for decades by psychophysics, represented the moment when two geometric patterns cannot be differentiated from each other and must be inversely proportional to the number of possible geometric arrangements. Well, just as there is a representation of the outside world, there is also a process in which one has information about representation, and is the process of knowing about what a representation represented, what we commonly call consciousness. The state of consciousness is a gigantic evolutionary step, almost like the one that inert materials give to become living. Compared to the being that only has representations, he who has conscience is like a giant next to a mosquito. It would seem, from the preceding discussion, that only there are two states, that of information and that of consciousness. Without, however, this is only apparent, there is a third state, characterized by knowing that one knows, by being aware that one is aware of. This third state is the next evolutionary step, the superconsciousness. Such is the state sought, the only one acceptable state now, of giving credit. On giving credit, worlds are unraveled, new universe of giving credit. Of giving credit, the poet friend becomes continuous receiver cognition. Of giving credit. From giving credit, SLB dirty, sick and crazy who sniffs his watch and looks at it repeatedly. Of giving credit. It turns into time stop who experiences new methods. Of giving credit. From giving credit, the costumer, simple and plump, becomes an accountant stories, creator absolute of lives of giving credit. On giving credit, a dog, animal playful and good, room to be aware of the danger, caretaker of territories and possessor of being, of giving credit. On giving credit, the vain verb and empty becomes an experience of giving credit. From giving credit, the music, only rhythm, melody and percussion of giving credit, becomes encrypted message, golden drop of realities of giving credit. From giving credit, the useless old man, amnesiac and infantile of giving credit, is transfigured in possession of secrets and wisdom of giving credit. On giving credit, the child, small and defenseless, becomes a teacher of giving credit. From the beginning, when the past has been achieved, it clarifies in all its destroyed dependencies. When we manage to live respecting our capacity to continuous change and discovery, when memory ceases to be a pretext, when we are able enough to see and in what we see there is no chance, when every moment is the most valuable and you stop play, when each word comes from and arises from being, the only doubt is the ability to penetrate universes, when fear is replaced by wonder and loneliness by uniqueness, when the only valid thing is to know, when all this happens and what remains to be clarified is the reason and the meaning of being here, one is one step away from being. When this last is still known, the life of the to-be, of the explanations, the life of the caveman was a continuous struggle for physical survival. What explained everything was the rule that when applied maintained life. The philosopher of that era was the one who realized the game that should be played practice so as not to die. The life of the man of the tribe of magic and superstition was of constant wonder and fear of the natural forces. What explained everything was the behaviors, stereotypical ones, that had to be carried out to avoid relapse, the power of those forces upon one. The philosopher of that time, he was the one who realized the game he had to play to not losing. The life of a member of a medieval guild was knowledge of the trade and the rules and laws that allowed coexistence. What explained everything were the secrets of the manual labor and the qualities and position of the guild. The philosopher of that time was the one who realized the game that one had to practice so as not to change. The life of the man of the Crusades had as its goal save the sacred places. What explained everything was the way to achieve that goal. The philosopher of that time was the one who he realized the game that had to be played in order not to sin. The life of the Renaissance man was the discovery of natural laws. What explained everything was curiosity to know them. The philosopher of that time was the one who gave himself realize what the reason for knowing was. All eras have had different interests in life. All have been explained according to their level. When real development has occurred, it has meaning, destroy an explanation, and the behaviors and goals. That kept her. It has become increasingly difficult to explain, and the explanation has approached simplicity. The social man has become a warrior, the warrior in thought. The thinker becomes a politician, the politician in religious, and the religious man. This is where the philosopher disappears. From memory, the highest level at which a human being functions is the one in which memory disappears, the one in which there is a past worth remembering. That is, that now is the only path to development. The man who truly respects himself is the one who trusts their ability to live in continuous rebirth and transformation, that for which the game ceases to exist, acts or words and memory. He who knows that each moment can mean death, and therefore lives it as if it were the last. At this level, memory is fiction or pretext, reflection limited by moments that are not and were not, fallen into the mud of non-being. Of the totality, all stars are found at any point from which they are observed. All objects can observe from wherever we are. This means that at any infinitesimal point on the universe converges the information of this one. If this is true for what surrounds us, it is also true for ourselves. The totality of ourselves can be observed from any reference point. The only distinction is perspective, not existence, of seeing and hearing. The question is not how do we see, but why do it? The question is not how we hear, but whether we can do so. Light as light and sound as sound, pain as pain and pleasure as pleasure. There is no one within us who sees, hears, suffers, or be happy. There is no one outside of us who does it either. Same, since these things do not exist in themselves in the way we see and perceive them. The amazing and esoteric thing is that we see, hear, and we feel. That's the question, here in the world of the third way. A path has as its starting point and reference the give credit to everything, with reference to the self. There is another way that by starting point and reference has to give credit to everything with reference to God. The first, everything has humanity. In the second, everything has religiousness. And there is a third way, the one that gives credit to both in one. It is the path that leads to the third state of communication. If the brain functions as a production system expanding four-dimensional energy fields, and these contain information within themselves, if the other's universe is a four-dimensional space of expanding energy fields, so the communication between the brain and the universe of the other is possible through the reciprocal influences that both fields exert. Not only communication but knowledge of this. And not only the knowledge of it but its meaning. And not only the meaning of knowledge of the universe, but the universe itself as a cognitive entity of the artist. A true artist always expresses his inner self in his works. But, unlike other people who express this self on a daily basis, The artist uses the canvas, musical composition, or written work. The artist's path is full of vicissitudes. He continually travels between the universe of being, with all its complexity and fantasy, free from all limitations, and the need to convey that universe. The external structure of a work of art is always a pretext for its internal transmission. Whoever is able to see the hidden content of a work of art will understand the message and will not confuse it with the structure. They will understand that the message is always directed at themselves. Of being and doing. A and B are talking. A says, there are two levels, one in which one is what one is doing and one in which one is not. In the first, doing is something alien and strange, only imposed or opposed, never authentic. In the second, everything becomes what one does. The self is that. Only two, asks B. I try to think about the existence of another level and I can't do it because I'm on it, answers A. What would you think about the possibility of being in what you're doing? B asks ironically. Well, I'd rather see it from above in its meaning. A answers seriously. B insists. Being in doing is beautiful. A thoughtfully answers. My way of being in what I do is by seeing the meaning of what I've created, my ideas and images, and those of others too. B nods and remains silent. A feels and suffers from the projection of the world. The world of objects and beings we perceive is different from that of the objects and beings we imagine. We project the former onto the outside, while we do not project the latter. The difference is clear and simple. On an experiential level, we rarely confuse the starting point and origin of our object relationships with that of our imaginative ones. However, on a functional level, the difference is obscure and complex. The reason for the difficulty is the indisputable fact that both the perceived world, originating from the outside, and the one that arises from within, result from the activation of our brain. Therefore, the distinction does not depend on the existence or absence of an external world, but on the differentiated way in which, in both cases, the brain machinery is stimulated. At this point, it's not the activation of central structures that is the cerebral cortex that makes the difference, since that also occurs in both cases. In fact, the direct, artificial stimulation of a cortical point causes the appearance of images and sensations that, in origin and detail, are impossible to distinguish from those that occur when an external object activates them through normal sensory pathways. For the same reason, it's not the presence or absence of activation of these sensory pathways that makes the difference. Perhaps analyzing the imaginative phenomenon is the key to understanding it. When we imagine, worlds appear, and within them is the self, included and undifferentiated. When we are awake, however, it is the world that is included in the self. In one case, we are the observed, and in the other, the observers. In one case, we do not project outward, and in the other, we do. The self must be associated with that portion of our brain that receives information from it, condensed and fundamental information, but information nonetheless. The sensation of external projection of the world could be related to the sequence in which this portion is activated. During wakefulness, activation would be the final point of the chain, resulting from previous representational processes. In contrast, during imagination, the activation of this portion would be the initial point of the chain, the cause of the resulting representational process.